Well, welcome everyone to our CG webinar on student agency and self-formation in higher education. It's a book launch and it's a discussion, and we have with us two of the three editors and one of the contributors as well. And I'll introduce our discussion leaders in a moment, but let me take you through the housekeeping slides in the usual way. Remember that during the webinar, you'll be recorded. And the webinar will end up on our YouTube channel, and you'll be able to access it also through our website within the next 24 hours or so. Now, during the webinar, keep your microphone off until you come into the Q&A section of the discussion, because if you're participating in the Q&A, it always works better when you turn your microphone on. Before then, though, we find that the microphones on can interfere, with the webinar. Extraneous noise gets caught and so on. So we ask you to turn off until that moment when you enter the discussion. We advise you to use speaker view in the top right-hand corner there with the huge red arrow, because that enables you to see who's speaking at any given time. That's quite helpful in piloting through the webinar. Now, to enter our discussion, and our discussion is a crucial part of the webinar, we invite you to use the chat. Post your question or your statement for the presenters in the chat. And then from the chat, I can select you into the discussion. And if we're going to invite you to speak, and we certainly would want to do so, I'll send you a little note in the chat saying I'm going to bring you in next. When you are invited in on camera, turn on your microphone, turn on your camera if you can, and then tell us who you are and where you're from. And if you want to enter the discussion, and please do so early. We're finding when people come in the last 5 or even 10 minutes, they can sometimes be too late because we have a full speaking list. So make sure that if you're really keen to say something, that you say it in the chat round about 2:30 UK time or 2:40, and then I'll be sure to be able to select you into the discussion. So now to our presenters, and we've got with us first Yusuf Oldac, who's an assistant professor based at Lingnan University in Hong Kong. And he's also a core centre fellow at the Institute of Policy Studies in the same institution. And Yusuf did his doctoral training at Oxford, and I had the pleasure of being one of his examiners, in fact, when he completed his thesis without amendment and was passed, which is something that one of the other presenters in this group of presenters would like to do also soon. And I'll introduce her in a moment. Yusuf is working on a number of themes in higher education studies. He's entered the discussion of science and global science and relations between scientists across the world, and he's making significant contribution in that area, as well as what he's doing with self-formation and agency in the book. Now, his other fellow presenters, we've got Soyoung Lee and Kelsey Inoue, and Soyoung Lee is the one who's going to examination soon. She's done a thesis study of academic self-formation among Korean students who are, and two groups of Korean students. She's looking at Korean students who've gone to the UK for their higher education, and Korean students who remained in Korea and done their higher education there. So she's also comparing mobile students with students who remain within one country when looking at self-formation. And she's like Yusuf, had a scholarship to cover the cost of her doctoral study, and I have to say that they're hard to get, too hard, in fact. But both of our presenters, the first two presenters, have had that scholarship. And we've got Kelsey. Kelsey Inoue is a research associate at the Centre on Skills, Knowledge and Organisational Performance. So she's a little bit ahead of Soyoung in career terms, in terms of timing, and I think closer to Yusuf in terms of when she graduated. But she's done the rare thing, I think, of turning her doctoral PhD studies into a continuing research career at Oxford, and she's a supernumerary fellow at Jesus College, as well as her association with the Department of Education. Her research interests include doctoral education itself, scholarly communication, and PhD career trajectories, and she's been publishing regularly in those domains. So you're going to hear more from them in a moment, but I think it's Yusuf that I've passed the screen to at this point. Yusuf, it's all yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this lovely introduction. Let me start by sharing my screen. Let's get that out of the way. PowerPoint, okay. So can you all
We can see that.
Yeah. And it moves, right? Okay, so thank you very much once again. We're really honored to be here. It's really a pleasure. It's a bit late here in Hong Kong. Sorry if I look a little tired. I'll do my best to stay energetic and explain everything well. So today we will do a book launch and a discussion on it. The title of the book is Student Agency and Self-Formation in Higher Education. We're really excited about this book, and we hope that it'll be beneficial to you in your studies if you're interested in this topic. So today we have three presenters. By order of appearance, I start first, Yusuf. I will introduce the book overall and give you the main details, core idea, etc. And then Soyoung Lee will continue. She will present in the capacity of chapter author this time, although she is also the editor as well. So she will introduce her chapter, and then we will have Kelsey, and she will introduce her collaborative chapter, which is very valuable contribution to the book. The book itself it has three editors. Myself, Lili Yang, I guess she's already among the listeners. We're very thankful for her contribution, very crucial. And then Soyoung Lee as well. Let me check my timing so that I finish on time. Okay, so let me start by introducing the core idea of the book. So the book argues for positioning students at the center of higher education, drawing from the concepts of student agency and self-formation. The book highlights that higher education has broader and more important purposes than what a neoliberal human capital approach would suggest, and explores how students exercise their agency and realize self-formation as inherently connected concepts throughout university education. In this book, we provide disciplinary, cultural, and contextual diversity, as the chapters provide international perspectives to the readers interested in higher education theories, policies, and practice. So let me give you the definitions of the core concepts. I've been, mentioning these, right? Agency, self-formation. What are these? So the definitions of the two concepts here are to the extent that they do not limit the ensuing discussions in subsequent chapters, because each chapter focuses on the same, main topic, but they have a different angle. They take the topic in a different perspective. So what is meant by student agency? The concept acknowledges students as agential subjects and incorporates the aspects of general human agency and the distinct features specific to education. So generally, human agency refers to individuals' capacity and autonomy to act with their self-determined objectives in mind. Agency stems from human consciousness and critical thinking, which facilitates reflexive deliberations and actions in the forms of active engagement and negotiation with the environments, whether challenging or resourceful and facilitating. Student agency differs from general human agency, particularly because of the impact of education. On the one hand, education is believed to enhance student agency by fostering well-being, skill development, critical thinking, human capability, and thus freedom. But on the other hand, the success of education depends on the presence of student agency, which is essential for initiating student engagement in the form of self-motivated, self-regulative, and self-reflexive thinking and behaviors. What is meant by self-formation? Student self-formation is a multifaceted concept with deep historical roots, combining both ancient and modern philosophies. While the manifestation of this concept varies from context to context, self-formation primarily emphasizes the role of students as the masters of their educational experiences in higher education. They are active learners who shape the holistic development through active agency. The concept of self-formation goes against reducing students to consumers, income maximizers, or passive information receivers. The association between reflexive agency and education concurs the argument that higher education is a process of self-formation. Higher education can enhance students' self-forming capacities. The potential of higher education can only be activated by students' active agency. So as I mentioned, each chapter contributes to an aspect of the core argument. Here I provide a link to the table of contents. The slides will be up later. You can access it. So in this slide, I will discuss briefly the structure of the book, the table of contents, and briefly introduce the chapters. So the book is made up of three main sections. Here you see the first one is actually the introductory chapter. And I will introduce this a little after this slide, so let me not go into it. But then we start with this section of conceptualizing student self-formation in higher education. Under this section, you can find chapters that focuses on conceptual discussions about self-formation. For example, the first chapter under this section is from Simon Marginson. So he discusses antecedents of student self-formation in social theory and educational philosophy. You can find really interesting discussions here about, the contemporary and older antecedents to the idea of self-formation. And then it is followed by a comparative chapter led by our colleague, fellow editor as well, Lili Yang. In this chapter, we discuss agency and student development in higher education with a cross-cultural and cross-disciplinary exploration. So if you're interested in cross-cultural and disciplinary perspectives, this chapter is the one for you, basically. And then we have from Soyoung Lee, the mechanism of student agency in self-formation through knowledge engagement in higher education. So this one will be presented by Soyoung herself. So let me not go into details about this chapter at this point. And then the second section of the book is about depicting student agency in international higher education. So under this section, we provided the chapters that focuses on internationalization aspect. For example, the first one discusses student agency and becoming in international programs in Vietnamese universities. So very interesting empirical findings from internationalization programs in Vietnamese universities here. And then the following one is from the colleagues, Than Pham and colleagues from Australia. They discuss conceptualizing the employability agency and international graduates. Again, in the international higher education context and about the employability, showing that the idea of agency and self-formation is not only, just about the academic aspect, but maybe broader than that. So this chapter is a bit on that topic. And then the last chapter of this section is from Kazuhiro Kudo, our colleague from Japan. It discusses the role of higher education institutions in fostering students' cosmopolitan agency and self-formation. This chapter also provides empirical data, information from Japanese universities, and it discusses cosmopolitan agency and self-formation. And the last section of the book, it's about linking student agency in higher education with the wider society. This section is also very important, especially in the literature. There are discussions that, the relationship between agency or self-formation with the wider context is less studied. There are those arguments. So you can find some discussions, theoretical and empirical discussions under this section. The first one is by me. It's about the civic aspect of student self-formation in international higher education. So I provide a temporal framework on how self-formation may be working in the international education with this perspective of civic aspect. I use the term apprenticeship in new worldviews because I think it's really like apprenticeship, but there is agency there. It's not about being structured to the society or only. The last one, new spaces for agency in doctoral education and an ecological approach, a very interesting pioneering work by our colleague here, Kelsey and Soren. Soren couldn't join us today, but Kelsey will introduce the chapter to us later. So let me not get into too much details about it now. So how to get the book? I wanted to add this, in case you want to have a quick access. Here's the link. You can check it later if you want to order it for your university, etc. We are surprised and happy to see that the book has already passed 1,200 accesses to its landing page. It's been a few months only. And we hope the book will benefit scholarship across disciplines and serve as a good source book for researchers interested in this topic. So I know I had a very limited time among the, we distributed the time between us, but let me at least do my best to give you a glimpse of what the first chapter is about, which is titled Students at the Heart of Higher Education, an Introduction. So in this chapter, we start with an historical overview of higher learning. And with that, we see that students in higher learning have never been as narrowly defined as they tend to be in the last decades. The narrow definitions of the last decades include reducing students to consumers, income maximizers, or passive information receivers. I'm sure most of you will agree with this anyway. I discussed with many of you among the audience these things separately in a few conferences. Also, this chapter provides an overview of the relevant literature. For example, the review of the research on student experiences discusses how agency and self-formation are implied in the extensive theories and concepts of student development in higher education. So some of the theories already, point towards this, although they do not explicitly engage with it. And then we move to the emerging line of literature that engages with the agency and self-formation concepts more explicitly. So there is a burgeoning line of literature that explicitly discusses these terms, and they are reviewed in that chapter. You're welcome to have a look afterwards. So here's a nice photo of us from the symposium that originated the book. Well, it was pandemic times, so everyone is wearing masks. And on the screen, you can see all those who cannot join us in person. It was a really fruitful one. So following this introduction to the book, the chapter authors will discuss their chapters. The first one to follow is Soyoung Lee. She will discuss her chapter on the mechanism of student agency in self-formation through knowledge engagement in higher education. And then my colleague Kelsey will take up, and she will talk about new spaces for agency in doctoral education and ecological approach. So one of them focuses on the individual aspect more by highlighting the academic self-formation, and by contrast, the latter has a focus on the wider society as well. So hopefully there will be a good contrast and good food for thought for us today. So Soyoung, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Yusuf. Hi, everyone. I'm Soyoung Lee. I am both a co-editor and a chapter contributor for this book. I am very honored to have this opportunity to present my work on behalf of other contributors, amazing contributors. So my chapter is part of the third section that focuses on conceptualizing self-formation. And this chapter tries to conceptualize the role of student agency in self-formation with a particular focus on the domain of knowledge engagement, students' engagement with knowledge, basically. Next slide, please. Thank you. So higher education, as Yusuf has already explained, is an emerging concept in the literature which foregrounds student agency in the purpose, process, and products of higher education. So its initial summative theorization is originated from a large-scale empirical research of international student experiences. So this background has led to the following three features of the existing literature. The first, researchers have dominantly focused on self-formation in international higher education. In other words, the idea of self-formation is more accepted in the literature on international students rather than in general higher education research. It's probably because the issue of neglected student agency is more pressing and conspicuous in international education literature. Second, the normative and comprehensive nature of self-formation has confined empirical investigations of self-formation to providing examples of what is already said, rather than critical evaluation and development of the concept. Third, the key concept of self-formation, which is student agency, tends to be treated as buzzword. So operationalizing student agency is an important task, and as a unit of analysis, of course. And this chapter, my chapter, aims to unveil the underlying mechanism of the operation of student agency in self-formation. So taken together, self-formation, it'd be to advance the research program of self-formation and student agency. it'd be helpful to delineate the research focus on a specific aspect. For instance, an academic domain of self-formation is experienced by all students regardless of their local or international status. So that's going to be my focus of this presentation. Next slide, please. So first, I will conceptualize student agency based on Margaret Archer's realist social theory. In realist ontology, Archer argues that structure and agency are two independent but interactive layers of stratified reality. What she specifically emphasizes is the role of reflective agency that refers to people's internal conversation about themselves in light of the situation of the self, and vice versa. So this role of reflexivity that constructs the interactive and autonomous relationship between agency and structure, it incorporates the two major approaches to student agency in the current literature. One that adopts psychological approaches to emphasizing intrapersonal cognitive thinking behind human behavior, and the other that is sociological and focusing more on how agents interact with the structure. So one of the strengths of this realist social theory in conceptualizing agency is that Archer not only theoretically, but also empirically investigated how people enact reflective agency. So next slide, please. This chapter is based on my doctoral research, which is more larger scale, and it combines both conceptual discussion and empirical investigation to develop this theory of academic self-formation. So this presentation talks about a little bit of this bigger research project. During the interviews with Korean students that I focused on, I asked questions to prompt their internal conversation or reflexivity about themselves. So every participant frequently used the Korean word "열심," that can be translated into passionate, hard work, or effort in short. So they use this term in evaluating their past self, regulating the present self, and making differences in the future self. This indicates that how students regarded their own actions and efforts as a controllable variable of their own formation, at least during academic activities, I should emphasize. So another distinctive tendency was students' critical and negative account of themselves during the interviews. The longitudinal analysis of my study reveals that self-criticism is not the manifestation of low self-esteem or crushed confidence or restricted agency. Instead, it indicated strong self-efficacy beliefs that one could be and should be better. This shows continuously developing ideal self and ever becoming self-formation beyond the unilateral or linear process of achieving goals. So these different aspects of reflective agency, effort, and self-criticism, they seem to similarly operate as a mediator between the subject self and object self. This distinction of the self, these two different self, subject and object self, or me self and myself, are frequently and very generally discussed in the psychology or prominent self theories. Next slide, please. However, agency cannot be reduced to an atomic or inner psychological process, of course not, but it interacts with external factors, so it can give space to resources for self-formation. Students in my study, identified the teacher-student relationship as an important contextual factor that influences their engagement with knowledge. So I examined how students exercise their reflective agency in light of their relationship with their teachers in higher education. The participants were found to voluntarily conform to the perceived authority given in the academic setting. However, conforming behaviors are often seen opposite to resistance, implying weak agency or restricted agency by structure. This chapter, however, challenged such an assumption and argued that conformity is also an aspect of agency. When students perceived that their self-formation can be more effectively achieved by using a medium, they can intentionally place themselves in a context that is controlling, but can also direct them towards the ideal future self. I call this form of reflective agency as active conformity to distinguish it from more general understanding of conformity. So through active conformity, students intentionally delegate their self-control to referential others in the course of self-formation. Next slide, please. So this chapter also revealed that these different aspects of agency change throughout higher education, demonstrated by two examples. One is a master's student studying art design who experienced a significant shift in the definition of good art as she moves from Korea to UK higher education. She found that while she was studying in Korea, she thought Korean field of art placed a great emphasis on artwork that demonstrates great effort and extensive time an artist puts, even when the idea behind the artwork was not that great. In contrast, when she moved to the UK, her institution evaluated artwork based on its core idea rather than how complete, precise, and meticulous the artwork is. So in a new academic setting, these students developed a new approach to making effort, which was found as an aspect of agency, as we discussed. Another example is the case of students in sociology. I'll be short about this example. As this student immerses herself into concepts like power or equality that is common in sociological studies, she gradually questions the authority of the teachers that she took for granted for a long time, and she revised her conceptions and behaviors towards this relationship that her approach to conformity. I'm sorry. So these examples demonstrate the knowledge impact on the changing reflective agency. As you can see in the figure, the Vygotsky's model of human learning through instrumental acts provides a theoretical elaboration of this finding. Vygotsky imagines that people as a subject of action can use an artifact to make changes in objects, which in turn bring changes in the subject. For example, we use language to communicate with the social world, but this process results in learning of the people involved as the language influences inner communication. As you might have noticed in the figure, the mediating impact of knowledge in Vygotsky's theory resonates with the previous diagrams that I presented in previous slides that illustrate mediating impact of reflexive agency. These combined, I develop a conjecture that knowledge can be understood as a social language that becomes internal language, which shapes reflexive agency of students as students engage with knowledge. Next slide, please. So this is my final slide already. In conclusion, this chapter has touched upon 3 points. First, I introduced various aspects of reflective agency, including efforts, self-criticism, and active conformity. This points out the need to consider not only the extent of agency or weaker or stronger agency, but also the content of agency, the different aspects of agency. Second, these different aspects of reflexive agency were found to operate in a similar mediatory mechanism. While self-criticism and effort mediated the interaction between the object and subject self, active conformity was practiced in students' interaction with the environment. Finally, student agency transformed throughout higher education, while one of the explanatory factors was disciplinary knowledge in my study. I conceptualized this emerging agency through knowledge engagement as disciplinary agency, which I will discuss further in another publication. So now I give the stage to Kelsey for her next presentation. Thank you so much for listening.
Well, thank you so much, Soyoung, and thank you to Yusuf, Lili, and Soyoung for inviting me to speak about our chapter today, which was written with Soren Bengston of Aarhus University. Next slide, please. So I will be giving a brief overview of the chapter today. Essentially, due to the growing complexity of the university and of doctoral education in terms of its embeddedness within various societal and professional and cultural contexts, this chapter draws upon Barnett's work to argue for an ecological approach to PhD student agency. In this chapter, we focused primarily on doctoral education in the humanities, arts, and social sciences as examples. I'll begin by briefly conceptualizing ecological agency and then provide 4 quick examples of spaces in which PhD researchers may exercise agency in different aspects of the ecology. Next slide, please. So, as I said, we've drawn upon Barnett's Ecological University to frame our argument for agency in doctoral education. Essentially, Barnett argued that knowledge and education that's produced and created in universities is impossible to be separated from wider political and social expectations, as well as cultural and legal traditions of specific countries or regions. So in other words, the university is very much embedded and interconnected with all these various spaces within society. And as such, the university is influenced by this array of factors or areas, and in turn can influence the world and its contexts through the various actors and stakeholders that are part of the university. So within the university, PhD researchers are key stakeholders, and thus they may influence these surrounding societal contexts through their research, teaching, or broader sort of public engagement work. And so as part of this university, doctoral researchers thus have agency, which is also, entangled with these wider societal forces, which could include political agendas or discourses around research impact, funding landscapes, narratives around publish or perish and academic productivity, as well as, the precarious academic labor market. And so for doctoral researchers, an ecological framing of agency means recognizing the ways in which they can contribute, but also be in some ways constrained as they navigate these different systems of which the university is part. And although we don't want to also discount the importance of individual intentions as agency that can influence PhD students' trajectories, what we're doing is sort of arguing for taking also a broader perspective on how we understand agency and the ways that it's entangled with these different spheres. So next slide, please. So now, as I said, I'll go into a few brief examples of these different spheres of agency. The first of which is careers. So as is, well documented, PhD holders are increasingly working in non-academic sectors, and so national and institutional policies are placing more emphasis on things like transferable skills, structured training, which is all kind of transforming traditional understandings of the purpose and the nature of a PhD. In a lot of the literature, it's become quite easy to frame this context as potentially problematic due to, again, precarious academic career trajectories and the applicability of the skills you learn in a PhD to work in other sectors. However, we also believe that this widening career landscape can also offer opportunities for agency, as PhD students can be very proactive in their own career and professional development, preparing for several possible career trajectories, which may include developing different skills, doing interdisciplinary or cross-sector work, which is increasingly supported by universities. Next slide, please. Doctoral writing is another space for agency, as diversification of the thesis genre means that PhD students are no longer restricted to the monograph as their means of knowledge production, and they are increasingly choosing to do things like a thesis by publication or integration, which also means kind of moving between sort of different genres of doctoral writing. While thesis by publication has received some criticism due to its relationship with rhetoric around publish or perish and kind of pressures on the academic labor market, the genre can also provide spaces for agency, as PhD researchers have the ability to choose from different thesis formats and can select ones that best align with their research designs and also their professional goals. At the same time, other work is happening that is looking at how PhD students may disrupt the thesis genre in terms of things like language and structure, and drawing on creative techniques to define how we see what counts as doctoral writing. Next slide, please. So a third area that we have touched upon in the chapter is citizenship. So the PhD curriculum is still kind of widening out beyond sort of traditional and institutional boundaries. So for instance, humanities research is increasingly expected to have a societal impact, influenced by government policies and funding bodies that are sort of framing the purpose and the focus of research in the humanities as well as social sciences. And so increasingly, humanities PhD scholarships and social sciences as well may be co-financed with, external partners in public or private sectors, who may have different expectations for PhD research and different understandings of what constitutes research. And so this citizenship of doctoral education and the PhD opens up new possibilities for what it means to be a PhD student, where PhD researchers can find meaning in social and cultural connection during the PhD by working across different sectors through their work. And elements of this trend aligned with Barnacle's call for a greater capacity to care for society through a careful PhD. Next slide, please. So finally, the fourth example that we touched upon in the chapter is justice. And justice is connected with citizenship, but we suggested that maybe having it as a category of its own could also be helpful because of the specific focus on power and power relationships. So power and freedom and those sorts of concepts have been highlighted in literature on PhD education, particularly in terms of things like supervision and kind of the institution, the university practices, as well as in what we understand what constitutes knowledge. And so this focus on power within universities and the PhD curriculum has also influenced discussions about, whether PhD researchers have any responsibilities towards society doing their research, whether PhD projects, could have an explicit or incorporated social justice dimension. And so what we've sort of called this justice equality can also be a space for exercising agency in that, for instance, in some universities, PhD students have set up their own PhD associations, which allow them to have kind of a political voice within their institutions. So for instance, in Denmark, this is something that I guess is quite common, and PhD students are quite involved in voicing their concerns around governance and things for PhD education. And so through this, these PhD students develop an awareness of how they navigate their various institutional roles and also their sort of researcher selves, and how these different roles might contradict or complement each other. So last slide, please. And so finally, the four spaces for agency that we described in this chapter, again, emerge from this growing sense of interconnectedness around doctoral education. These spaces reach beyond the boundaries of the academy and present PhD researchers with opportunities to shape different aspects of their lives. And we framed this as emerging from Barnett's Ecological University, which we've used to understand how the university interacts with the different contexts within which it's situated. Yes, that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you. These are references, and if you'd like to contact us later, these are our email addresses. So we should give the screen back to Simon because it's discussion time. Thank you very much all, and thank you.
And thank you to Yusuf, to Soyoung, and to Kelsey for those accomplished presentations. Really great slides and really good, clear statements. But what was really good was the way you took us into the content of the book and the chapters, and there's a lot of meat in those. And I think this webinar will repay, more than one viewing. in YouTube because there's a lot of substance in what you've said. I'll start the discussion with one question, and then we'll bring in Alison Leslie with her interesting question about sociology. My question is this: the marking out agency self-formation, student-centeredness in this way as an area of inquiry and as a set of concepts that can be used in other educational inquiries. What's the significance of this? I mean, there's a vast literature on teaching and learning, which has partly come out of school teaching as a field of empirical inquiry, partly come out of work done in higher education itself primarily. But it's in higher education studies, teaching and learning is probably about half the total literature. And it mostly sees the process of student learning from a teacher viewpoint. So what have you done with this book and with your work? I mean, how have you changed things? Are you overturning the previous approaches? Are you supplementing them? What's the significance of the move you're making? You can choose who wants to answer that. Feel free.
Okay, maybe I will hit the ground running, but I'm sure my colleagues have a lot to say. Yeah, you're right in the sense that almost half the literature is about teaching and learning. But I think the idea of self-formation, maybe how it differs from the others, is the positioning of students in it. I think the students are not passive receivers of knowledge. That's the way I see it, and that's how I perceived it when I was doing my research as well. When you put the students at the center, then how you define, how you prepare your curriculum changes, how you see when you give homework changes. I think it's a comprehensive approach basically. That's one way to look at it, maybe. And I think we're not replacing any idea. I think what we see is in the past it was less narrowly defined, the idea of higher education. But in some of other books also highlight there is this narrow definition of students keep coming again and again. And it's just almost dominating now. I think the strength of self-formation is reminding us that higher education should not only be defined in economic terms, and also bringing back the sociological perspective and psychological perspective into it, in my perspective, but not arguing that the other aspects are useless, not there, but giving a perspective, broader perspective to it. Let me just start the discussion this way, and I'm sure my colleagues may want to add more. Feel free, Soyoung and Kelsey, if you want to add.
Sure. I agree with Yusuf, and I'd like to add that the self-formation idea, I believe that it is more like rejuvenation and modernization of the already existing that has already been accepted for a long time. That kind of idea, very traditional idea. I think we are trying to bring it back to the center of higher education research, I guess. And also the Simon's question about teaching and learning research. I believe that teaching and learning research is really important, and it talks about it centers what students do in higher education, but it also talks about one aspect of higher education, I guess, because it's the purpose of teaching and learning higher education, if I dare say, would be how effectively students can learn and acquire knowledge in an efficient way. But that's one aspect of higher education, I believe. But I think the strength of self-formation idea is that it can link different aspects of higher education as well, such as the more intrinsic contributions of higher education, such as like student formation, knowledge formation, and social formation. I think student self-formation can link these different contributions of higher education by highlighting students' role and by highlighting the role of higher education in developing students as an agent of knowledge in society and themselves as well. So that's my thoughts. What about you, Kelsey? Do you want to add anything?
I agree with what Yusuf and Soyoung said. I think coming from a focus on doctoral education, traditionally PhD education was largely viewed as socialization into the discipline and where you sort of become enculturated into the university and the practices. And while I think that's true in a lot of ways, there's a lot of value in thinking about that. Over the past decade or so, people have been increasingly talking about agency and the role of PhD students in really shaping their own experiences, their own research, and what they can do to transform their own sort of research cultures. And I think that's part of what we're trying to highlight in our chapter, are sort of a wider view of the relationship between the individual and all these other sort of contexts around society. But I think a lot of the issues that we talk about in PhD education around agency are also highlighted in this book. And so I think it's been quite a valuable contribution to have everything kind of brought together.
And I think the kind of PhD experiences really encourages a high level of self-conscious reflexivity and thinking about how you're changing, how your own, evolution is occurring and what's I guess affecting that, external and internal. So it lends itself to conscious reflection on the self-formation idea. And I think the mobility experience of, transferring cultures, transferring contexts, moving between different knowledge environments, that's also stimulates that process of internal reflection and consciousness of your own mind, if you like, which seems to be an integral to this, notion of forming yourself, making your own educational and life journey on the basis of your, of both your experience and your inner mental reflection. So, I mean, in some ways, that Vygotskian idea that, that you bring the external into conjunction with the internal, and I guess is playing out here. Let's bring in Alison Leslie and for the first question from our participant audience, Alison.
Hi. Yeah, I was really, really interested in, well, all of the talks, thank you, but particularly the point you were making about disciplinary agency, Soyoung, because I support sociology students, largely international students in a UK university. I'm not a sociology expert, I'm an academic literacy expert. So my role is predominantly to sort of support them through that acculturation. But what I do see is that sort of self-formation and that transformation in a large number of the students, which is very, very nice to see. But it got me thinking that because, like you said, a lot of the students, I'm seeing them developing the confidence to be able to talk about a lot of these quite threshold concepts when they first arrive. Learning about, as you said, about, power, discourse, that kind of thing. And I just wondered whether, because obviously you obviously interviewed a lot of students from different disciplines. I wondered whether there was a sort of a correlation there between the type of discipline that they were studying and that ability to kind of have more agency. And then also I was wondering as well, because if I understood correctly, your students were all from Korea. The students that I support are mostly from China. So for them coming to the UK, this is their first experience of having a more sort of global learning experience where our style of teaching is very different to what they're used to, but they actually do appreciate being involved in dialogue and building that knowledge. Sorry, that was a very, very long question.
Oh, no. Thank you so much, Alison. What a wonderful and brilliant question. I was waiting for this kind of question. I named this concept as disciplinary agency because my data actually said something about disciplinary differences in agency development in higher education. So as you said, I had students from different disciplines, social science, humanities, and STEM fields. And then you're right, and they had differences in their agency development. And about the social sciences, and I tried to explain the differences between these agency development by delving into the different structure of knowledge. As you said, like social sciences and humanities, there is a work there is work, Mayton's work in 2015, and he kind of separated the STEM field as a knowledge code field, and then social science humanities as NOA code field, which means that these later the social sciences and humanities, they emphasize how the how NOA develops, and rather than accumulation of this knowledge, which is more emphasized in NOA code field. So I tried to explain the different structures of knowledge to understand why students develop this different shape and extent of agency. So your suggestion was really right, and according to my data, and also your point about Chinese students and the international students. My study compared international and local students as well, Korean students, both of them. And then you were right. So students, the mobility, this international mobility, was also another resource that I focused on as a resource for self-formation, because international students could use their international mobility as a way to change how they communicate knowledge, and also the content of knowledge as well, because they also encountered some cultural differences in knowledge. For example, I cannot be so long, but you're right. The disciplinary agency and mobility were really important resources for student agency development and self-formation. And then, it'd be wonderful if I could talk more about this. Thank you very much for your question.
Thank you.
I'm going to suggest that we don't take further responses to that excellent question from Alison, because we've got so many other people now crowding into the chat, wanting to talk, and really welcome that. So what I'm going to do is bring in 3 people, 3 questions, one after another, and presenters. I'm going to ask you to keep in mind, the questions. And make sure that the first person doesn't miss out when you give your responses and so on. And at the end of those 3, I'm going to, after your answers, I'll bring in one last question from Yunyi Zhang, and that will close the webinar. So the first person I'm going to bring in is Anding Shi. Could you come on to camera?
Yeah. Hi, Soyoung and Kelsey. And Yusuf, thank you for your presentation. My question is very short. Maybe Kelsey or Soyoung or anyone can answer this. Do you have any practical or pedagogical suggestions for utilizing the concept of students' agency and self-formation to enhance their learning experience? Thank you so much.
Okay, now remember Anding's question. Our next question is the big question in my view, actually, about the whole area, and that's Kathy Luckett's question. Kathy.
Hello, can you hear me okay? I'm speaking from Cape Town, so I won't put on my video. Thank you so much, firstly, for these wonderful presentations. I long to see the book. This is a question to which I don't have the answers, but it is something that intrigues me because these insights are also there in Buddhism, for example, that the self is better conceptualized as a process rather than a thing. And so if one thinks about this, you can relativize time, you can relativize history, and so on, place. And I'm just interested to think, is this something that we should sort of move away from because it's epistemologically relativizes too much? Or is it actually something that might be quite fertile to think with? And I would value your responses. I'm really thinking of post-humanism, neo-materialism, and there's a whole range of posts, I guess, starting with Foucault's idea of subjectivization. Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, and there's biopolitics, of course. I mean, there's a whole cluster of tricky concepts behind the question.
Yeah, and have a look at what Kathy said in the chat as well. That sharpens it. The other person we want to bring in now is Louise Nicholson.
Hi, thank you for letting me ask my question. I hope you can all hear me okay.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Yes, thank you so much for your fascinating presentation. I just wanted to ask you all if you had any thoughts about how these wonderful ideas about student agency and self-formation might affect kind of overall access to higher education kind of in the first place, and if this would improve kind of levels of informed agency about decision making and choices about kind of how people access it and how people engage with higher education as well. So that was something that I just wanted to perhaps see if that can link to what it is that's in your book. So thank you so much.
So we've got 3 questions. We've got 3 presenters. Please feel free to answer the questions. And if you do speak, though, answer all 3 if you can. And after you've completed your answers, we'll bring in Yunyi Zhang at the end, and that will be the end of the webinar. So please, over to you to respond. So who's going to do it?
This time, ladies first, maybe?
Yep, go ahead.
Okay, I'll start then. So I think first I'll start with Anding's question around practical or pedagogical suggestions. So I mean, I suppose one sort of practical suggestion that we talk about in doctoral education is around, supervision and sort of what is the role of a PhD supervisor. So some suggestions could involve supervisors also being aware of the changing nature of the PhD and its purpose, and sort of facilitating some of these conversations where doctoral students can begin to really critically reflect on their goals, their sense of agency and self-formation within various different spheres, whether it's writing or careers or citizenship, etc. But also, I think a lot of it is around raising awareness around doctoral researchers. Universities providing support for them in terms of resources, but also encouraging doctoral students to make use of different resources to kind of better understand, what is available out there in terms of different opportunities. So that's kind of one very basic practical suggestion in terms of agency and self-formation and learning. I'll move quickly to Kathy's question. This is a really good question, and it's quite a challenging question, to be honest, and I honestly don't know that I have a particular answer for this. I personally have not yet delved in this particular aspect of unitary autonomous self versus the self as a relational process. I think it's a really interesting idea, and I have read a little bit about it when looking at theories of identity. And it's interesting, if the self is relational and it sort of changes constantly in relation to different contexts, then there's questions around how agency perhaps changes in different contexts as we evolve and move through different situations as people. But yeah, I think I will just kind of leave it there, something that I have not yet fully engaged with, to be honest. And finally, Louise's question on agency, participation, and access to higher education. So this is something we talk a lot in my sort of postdoc project on widening participation with PhD researchers. And I think there's sort of a relationship here between kind of empowering students from different backgrounds to also have access and exercise agency in relation to accessing PhD programs or even undergraduate programs, because there's like the institutional side where the institution sort of needs to be a little more transparent and provide certain sets of information and support for students, which they can then be agentive in engaging with in order to try to access some of these programs. So it's kind of a dual relationship, I think, there on both sides. Yeah, I will pass
Thank you, Kelsey. Yeah, thank you, Kelsey. Let me add a bit to Kelsey's response. For Antin's question, I think Kelsey has already given a very good idea an answer. For me, Kathy's question and I'm sorry, Louis' question. I'm sorry. Yeah, Kathy and Louis' question was quite similar, and I'd like to answer it at the same time simultaneously. Because your question about autonomous self versus relational self, and then student agency who can do anything versus student agency who cannot get access because of their conditions, background conditions. It's quite. It can be both. What I'd like to say is actually this idea was developed through discussions with Simon and other colleagues. Self can be both autonomous and relational. We cannot say self is autonomous and not relational. We cannot say that self is embedded and not autonomous. From my understanding, from my ontological approaches, they are two different realities, but they are stratified but still existing together. So we can understand the reality and the self from two approaches, but we can use them at the same time, which means that really structure and then access to higher education, it is conditioned by structural factors, of course, students' background, financial and parental and cultural backgrounds, of course, but it is also conditioned by student agency. So yeah, I'd like to say, yeah, that's my answer. Yusuf, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I will add briefly because I know we're running out of time. I mean, my colleagues, they did a really good answers for these, I think. For example, especially Kathy's question, I think that's great food for thought and can be thought and used in future studies about this, I think, to develop our thinking more into this. That's my thinking. About practical aspects, Kelsey's examples of PhD supervision, that's very good. And in my own classes, I try to not position students as passive receivers, but I always try to everything. The class design basically is about positioning them as active students, right? That I think makes a difference and helps making them more and more active in the class. That's one of the aspects of this. But of course, if the class is very big, you cannot do much. In my current situation, some of my classes are really big, so I'm struggling with that. The access question, I think I don't have anything to add besides what my colleagues already said. So let me not take more time on that because I know Simon has one more question to divert forward to us.
Look, thank you all for your excellent answers, and I really appreciate the way you engage with those three excellent questions. Yunyi, Zhang, you've got the last question and almost the last voice in the webinar. So please come in now.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you so much for the presentations. I really enjoy your sharing about student agency and student self-formation from different perspectives. And actually, I'm doing a master's degree in the field of education, and my dissertation is about academic self-formation. So my question is quite practical, which is about how you conduct your empirical research practice. So I actually found that asking other people about their self-formation or their internal interactions, internal worlds can be super difficult. So could you please share about some strategies regarding how to unpack the abstract idea of self-formation when you conduct the interview? And maybe to be more specific, maybe question to Soyoung. So how you make the interview questions distinctively related to the idea of academic self-formation compared with the general idea of self-formation. Thank you.
Thank you, Junyi, for your wonderful question. Should I go first?
Yes,
yeah.
please.
Okay. Junyi, so your question about practical question about conducting interviews. So this idea of self-formation as an abstract idea, so which is difficult to conduct empirical investigation, that was the beginning of my research, right? So what I wanted to do, the research aim was to address that issue by trying to develop a theory of academic self-formation. What did I do? I need to go back to my what was it? Data collection practices. What did I do? So I tried to combine this conceptual research, different concepts related to student agency, because I wanted to, because the central concept of self-formation is student agency. So what was more important at first, at the beginning of this research, was to operationalize student agency, the question of how to practically interview students about their self-formation was how to conduct the interview about their student agency. So yeah, so operationalizing student agency was the first point that you should start, and then maybe it's better to have a clear idea of the theoretical framework of what student agency is, because what self-formation is, it's not there are elaborate conceptual discussions about that, but to empirically study it, I think it's your call which aspect that you're going to focus on, just like academic aspect of self-formation or mobility, I don't know, whatever you want. I guess you're interested in academic self-formation. So I tried to focus on students' academic aspects by asking questions about their academic experiences. And plus, since my research was conducted in digital higher education, because of the pandemic, I could focus more on students' academic self-formation rather than other social and intercultural or something like that, because their experience was highly reduced or limited to knowledge interaction. So the fieldwork and observation and interviews, fieldwork and observation was conducted during their academic learning themes, such as seminars, lectures. So that was helpful to focus on their academic self-formation, and also interview questions as well. Yeah, we can talk about it later privately. Thank you for your question.
I'm going to have to close it there, but
yeah, sorry.
The question of how you get into the inner consciousness, if you like, was addressed by Margaret Archer, in that when she looked at the inner conversation and the conversation between our social selves and our inner selves, and the way she developed her empirical research was to establish trust
right.
with her interviewees over a prolonged series of interviews. And eventually, she developed enough data from 30 people for a huge book. Tremendously interesting and valuable exploration, but it's not easy for any of us to talk about our inner selves, is it? And there are things there which we don't really know about ourselves until we start reflecting on them. So, it's a rich area. But perhaps we need to think more systematically about how we go about it. So, Junri's question, great question, and in practical sense, and thank you for that. Look, I want to thank our three presenters on your behalf, on everyone's behalf. I think that one of our best webinars, and Andy Warhol talked about how we all have 5 minutes of fame in the modern era. I think you've had 60 minutes of superstarness. It's on YouTube and something we can all go back to and look at again and learn from. Really, I hope for you it's been a good experience, because the three of you, because for me, and think many of us, it's been a memorable webinar, and one I certainly personally treasure. So thank you. Thank you, Yusuf. Thank you, Kelsey. Thank you, Soyoung. And good luck, Soyoung, in your Viva. And to everyone, our next webinar is kind of in a related area. It's Stephen Walsh from Manchester Met, talking about teaching excellence in higher education, policy making and leadership, but he wants to also come at a critique of the notion of student as consumer and human capital as the sole way of understanding student formation and so on. So a rich area for discussion. You've helped us a lot, the three of you, with that discussion. So thank you very much again. And to everyone who's still there, bye for now.